Soundproofing your car floor is potentially one of the best ways to make it quieter, and I can say that quite confidently as I've built up a wealth of experience soundproofing my entire car, and I'm not only going to show you how I did it, but how you can avoid my mistakes and quickly, as you can skip to the chapters you need. But just before we get going, disclaimer folks, this video is for entertainment purposes only, don't try this at home. Now, for anyone new to soundproofing cars, you really want to be doing it using 3 layers in most instances, and this isn't just me saying this or making it up. It's coming from professionals who have a presence on YouTube, like car builders and Resonix, who have been doing this professionally for many years. You want to start with a sound deadening layer, and the main purpose for this is to remove panel vibration. On top of that, for the second layer, you should be using a closed cell foam, and this is going to help absorb and dampen sound waves, as well as act as a thermal insulator in most cases, which should allow your car to stay cooler. And then lastly, on top of that, you want to be using mass loaded vinyl, which is an amazing blocker of sound. And now you know what the approach is, let's have a look at the materials we'll be using in detail. In terms of the products I'll be using, being based in the UK, I bought my products from Dodomat, who are based in Cambridge, and they have a wealth of experience offering soundproofing products to the masses. And no, this isn't sponsored, as I've used American products in the past like Canopus, and one of the very first products I used was Killmat, so I've used a bunch of different ones. But the reason why I went with Dodomat this time around is because they offer cost-effective options, their products are decent in my experience, and their delivery is insanely quick. So I ended up getting a car kit that they sell that includes the first 2 layers that we need, and then ended up buying 4 rolls of mass-loaded vinyl separately. And the reason why I knew how much to buy was because I measured the width and length of my car interior, with the width being about 4.5 feet, or about 1.3 meters, and 6.5 feet in length, or about 2 meters ish. And what you can do with these figures once you have them is times these together, and that will give you a square foot or meter squared total that you can then compare to the product you're actually buying. So in my case, the car kit covered about 3.5 square meters, with my surface area being about 2.7 square meters. So I knew I'd have enough material, even accounting for the little odd lumps and bumps here and there. The only caveat I'd add to this is that the first 2 materials are quite flexible, but mass loaded vinyl isn't. So you might want to buy more in case you end up not having enough, as it doesn't flex at all like the first 2 materials do. Speaking of the materials, the first layer, the sound deadening material, is a 70mm thick material, so not as thick as the other brands I've used in the past, but it handily comes in a roll, and this is important because it allows us to get more complete continuous coverage. But why would we want that? Well, the more gaps you have between your sound deadening mats, the more chance you are allowing sound to leak in. So the less gaps you have in theory, the less sound you are going to be allowing in. So it should mean a better result overall. But don't worry if you want to use pre-cut mats. You will see many videos from professionals using pre-cut mats, so don't be too discouraged away from using them if you feel more comfortable with them. You can always layer them and then use something like a finishing tape to cover up any imperfections or gaps. The 5mm closed cell foam that comes with the kit comes in a roll too rather than sheets, and you want to be doing the same thing here, as covering as much surface area as you can in a continuous fashion like the sound deadening material before. But this stuff is super sticky and quite hard to work with in the same way that sound deadening material is. So you may want to use stencils to help, or do what I did and use acoustic tape, or in my case Gorilla Tape, to cover up any gaps. Lastly, the mass loaded vinyl I bought separately is a 2mm thick product, and a bit of a heavier product than the other 2, but it is by design, as it does do a really good job of blocking road noise and wind noise. Do keep in mind though, this material is really hard to mold around surfaces and odd shapes, as mass loaded vinyl is really designed for laying flat, and you can just lay it as a full panel or cut it to size and just literally lay it down. It's not an adhesive back product like the other 2, and that is basically it for materials used. And you can really go to town here with the materials you use, and as a generalization, you'll tend to get better results if you're willing to spend more on better products. But I chose these as they are cost effective and aren't going to add too much weight to the car. Before you apply any of these materials, you are going to need quite a few tools to get the job done. Firstly, you're going to need a decent set of spanners or a ratchet set in order to remove the many different sizes of bolts that hold various things in place, like the seat belts, the battery, etc. You'll also need Torx screwdrivers or Allen key variants to remove the Torx bolts that are likely holding down your seats. I bought a Torx bit for my impact wrench, and I just used that as my Allen key variant broke when I tried to remove them. Do be careful if you go this route though, as you can end up stripping these bolts if you're not careful, and then you're in for a whole world of pain if you want to try and remove them. You'll also benefit from interior trim tools, as they are really handy when removing carpeting, prying open soft plastic, and removing clips that hold wiring looms in. Of course, you could likely do all of this with a flat-headed screwdriver, but having these tools to hand does make the job easier in my view, and this next tool is essential. You'll need a good roller in order to apply your sound deadening mats, and this is important as if your mats aren't adhered properly, A, they won't be as effective as they could be, and B, you are in danger of them lifting and trapping moisture underneath, and if that happens, you'll very likely end up creating the perfect conditions for rust to form. So a roller is essential. In terms of what roller you should use, there are broadly two types. The one I've used for most of my sound deadening projects is this ridge roller that I bought as a set of 3, which is really handy to have, as cars come in all wonderful shapes and sizes, and having that level of flexibility is nice, but it does come with a problem. Most professional installers will tell you that you should use the second type of roller, which is the smooth type, and the reason why is that this smooth type won't thin out the butyl in your sound deadening mats like ridge ones will. But in my experience, there wasn't much difference. You'll likely get better adhesion with the ridge rollers, but with thin sheets of sound deadening material, the extra pressure isn't really necessary. Plus, you'll still potentially have to deal with butyl expanding anyway, but you can always use finishing tape to stop the butyl material spreading. You'll also want to use a degreaser like this prep spray I bought that will help you clean your car before you apply your sound deadening mats to it, as you don't want to have any dirt on the surfaces you are applying these to. And you'll likely need scissors, and only scissors, if you've bought decent materials like the ones from Dodo Mat or Canopus, etc. But it's the cheaper ones that tend to need to be cut with a craft knife. But if you've got decent materials, you can just cut through them with scissors in my experience, making them super easy to work with. Before removing the interior, you'll want to disconnect the battery first to potentially stop the airbags in the seats going off when you remove them. It's just a case of removing these 2 bolts and then unhooking the wires, and that's it. Moving onto the seats, you'll want to slide your seat as far forward as it goes. I chose to do the passenger seat first, and before working on the bolts to remove the seats. If you have any extras like an armrest, you may benefit from removing that first. When you're ready to remove the Torx bolts holding the seat down, there are 2 at the back to remove, and once done, you can just slide the seat all the way back to remove the ones at the front. If you have difficulty accessing any of these, it may be because your seat is too low, so do make sure the height adjustment setting is as high as it can go if you have one. Once the 4 bolts are removed, there are a couple of wires that you'll need to disconnect before removing the seat. The white one has a clip that you can press in and then pull out. This green one is slightly fiddly and has a clip at the back that you need to press down to remove. Do take your time removing these, as you don't want to rush this and potentially set your airbags off. Once these are removed, you can use a stud removal tool to make easy work of the clip holding the wiring loom in place, and then you can remove the seat and put it to one side. You'll essentially be replicating this on the other seat, and for me, this process was exactly the same, as there were no additional steps needed. And thinking about it, I actually think it's worth doing this process once before you even buy anything for quite a few reasons. Firstly, it's a good opportunity to check that everything does come out and you aren't going to be hitting any roadblocks that are going to waste a lot of your time. And this is important, especially if this is your only car that you need to actually use. You don't want to be putting aside an entire weekend to only find out that you need to postpone your plans because you spent 5 hours trying to remove a nut that won't come out, or you spent ages like I did trying to figure out how to remove the rear seats, only to learn that you literally yank up on the seat base really hard and that's it. If you're familiar with removing interiors, you might not need to do this, but at the very least, it is worth visiting forums for specific cars, as each car is different and may require extra steps to remove. Once the rear seats are lifted up, you can start to peel away the carpeting, which might require gentle pressure to remove. Once you've worked your way down to the seat belts, you'll notice a bolt holding the seat belts in place that you will need to remove. I made use of a ratchet tool to remove these, and they came out quite easily. Once removed, you can move on to removing the handbrake covering that you can again remove with gentle pressure, as it is essentially just held in with clips. If yours is like mine and it's in 2 pieces, you might need to remove a few screws to remove the other half, and again just use gentle pressure to remove the gearbox housing. You can then essentially continue peeling your carpeting away from the sides and working your way to the front, where there may be a few other screws holding your carpeting down before it can be fully removed. You may also have to cut some of the carpeting, as there are connecting pieces from the driver side to the passenger side, and I prefer to do this rather than remove any more of the gearbox housing because, well, I'm lazy and I was quite tired at this point. But do persevere and your carpeting will come out eventually. And when examining it, you can see that the carpet underlay is actually quite thick in places, so there is some consideration given to sound insulation. It's just not very complete, but we're going to fix that, but not before giving the car a good clean. To prep the car for sound deadening, I cleaned the entire floor thoroughly with a vacuum and then used some degreaser to make sure the surface was as clean as it could be before laying down any sound deadening mats. And it is important that it is dry before laying any down, as you don't want to create any opportunity for rust to happen. Once done, you can then start to install the sound deadening mats, and you'll notice here that I didn't remove any of the factory installed deadener. I just worked over it instead because it is thin and it would be a nightmare to remove without dry ice, so I just left it on. To install the deadener, I always like to size it by eye and then apply and adjust. I aren't the kind of person who enjoys making stencils and then strictly adhering to them, but if you are, you'll likely get a more precise finish, but I like to fix as I go. You'll notice here that we aren't interested in putting the sound deadener everywhere, but rather focusing on flat panels, as that is where this material works best. This material is really designed to combat sound vibrations, and it's the large flat panels that vibrate the most, so you don't need to worry about covering complex shapes, as these shapes are normally made of quite thick metal that won't vibrate anywhere near the amount that flat panels do. So focusing on the flat panels makes the most sense here. As I mentioned previously, we are going for complete continuous coverage here, which means we want to minimize the gaps between the sound deadening material in order for it to work best, but you can use pre-cut sound deadening mats and slightly overlap them and then cover them with finishing tape if needed to achieve a similar effect. Once you have a piece cut to size, you can start to line it up and peel away the backing. I like to start sticking from the piece furthest away from me and then work towards me, so to speak, and at this point you can just flatten as you go, and you'll notice I'm making little cuts here and there to make sure these little circular plugs aren't being covered, as I don't want to compromise the car in any way. You don't need to worry too much about not making these cuts perfect, as finishing tape will allow you to iron out any imperfections you create as you go along. And as I got to the end here, you can see that I aren't covering the mounts that the seats sit on because the metal is very thick, and I also don't want to be covering any screw holes that we will need to use later. Once you've got your sound deadening mat stuck down, you can then begin to go over it with a roller. I used a smooth roller this time around instead of my usual ridge ones, and it does the job fine. These days, most sound deadening products have a raised surface by design, so you can see which areas you properly compress with a roller and which ones you haven't, which is handy, especially when working on large pieces. And if there are any difficult parts to roll, you can just use the butt of the roller to go over them with. Once you are happy with your piece being fully adhered, you can move on to the next flat area to soundproof. For me, this was the front passenger space, and you'll notice something interesting here. You can see that on the front passenger side there is quite a lot of padding and some polystyrene molds that create a nice shape for where the passenger puts their feet, and you'll notice that there is already some sound deadening under there, and that's because I've already done that area previously, so I aren't going to be doing it in this video, but it is quite easy to get under there and cover that area. For ease, I am going to use a full piece to cover over the kill mat that is exposed here, which is only a 50mm material anyway, so it could benefit with a better material being laid over it. And we are following the same principles when covering here as the previous area, cutting as I go, and then you want to be doing the rest of the car in the same way. And one thing I noticed when doing all this work is how weirdly shaped modern cars are compared to old ones. If you look at a lot of the soundproofing videos out there that tackle soundproofing the floor, you'll notice that a lot of the cars seem to be very flat, easy to cover shapes, which has not been my experience at all with my more modern car, and it's just something worth mentioning. When you've finished, you'll have something that looks like this, which is as close to 100% continuous coverage that I can get, and some people might say that I've put too much on here, so let's address that really quickly. Not to be confused with continuous coverage, which really means uninterrupted coverage. Some people suggest for each panel you cover, you only need to cover between 30 to 50% of any given panel to get the best results, but it's not that simple. The folks over at Car Builders raise a great point that for most people doing this at home, 100% coverage is best, as most people aren't sound engineers and don't know the optimum coverage rate or have the skills to do the statistical analysis, and I bet you would be pretty annoyed if you covered 30% only to find out 35% was better for your particular car, and that's even if you have the means to find that out. So you should be going for complete coverage in my view, obviously based on what the material is designed to do, and that's what I've done in all of my videos. But if you do want to do partial coverage because you worry about weight, that's reasonable, but you could be potentially running the risk of your material basically doing nothing because you didn't use enough. So it's worth keeping in mind. It's probably worth mentioning at this point that I spent a full day removing the interior and installing most of the sound deadening material onto the floor portion of the car, and because it's my only car, I then had to reinstall my seat so I could actually use it. So at the start of day 2, I decided to leave my interior installed, so that really means just leaving the front seats in, and then I could easily lift up the rear seats and get to work finishing covering this area with my sound deadening mats. And we are very much working in the same way as we have previously, and before long you should have a fully covered bench like this, and it is worth taking the time to go around with some finishing tape for any areas that have exposed butyl rubber, just so that it stops it from walking and impacting the effectiveness of your material long term. You can now move on to installing the second layer, which is the closed cell foam, and this material is really sticky. I won't be putting any under the heavily packed area or under the polystyrene insert, just because I don't want to impact how the carpeting lays when reinstalled, but you'll see later that I'm talking utter nonsense here, as I'm about to make my first mistake of many in a moment. For installing this material, I decided it would be easier to cut it into shapes that work around the plugs I avoided earlier when using the sound deadening mats, just because this material isn't as forgiving as sound deadening mats are, and to try and redeem the gaps I'm creating that are breaking my continuous coverage that I was banging on about earlier so much, I use Gorilla Tape to plug the gaps, but in reality I probably should have taken my time here and made a stencil. Now this is where I became a bit unstuck. Somewhere in my brain I thought it would be a good idea to get rid of my carpeting entirely. As I'm putting 3 layers down, I convinced myself that it's gonna look amazing. Don't do this. Keep your carpeting and fight off any crazy ideas you might have. I mention this because as a consequence, I figured I wouldn't need to keep any of the underlay stuffing that actually keeps the carpeting level in the passenger footwell, so I instead decided to waste loads of cell-based foam trying to make it level, which didn't really work, as you can see when I popped the rubber mat over the top of it. So don't get too big for your boots. Just stick to one layer of closed cell foam, and fortunately I didn't repeat this mistake on the driver's side, and then after having a much needed break I focused my efforts on the rear of the car. It was much easier to cut shapes to size for the rear, but on reflection I do wish I would have taken my interior out, as it would have allowed me to make better use of my material, and by better I mean allow me to work on getting continuous coverage rather than working in a piecemeal way that I did. But once you've cut a piece of closed cell foam, you can stick it down with relative ease, and then I like just gently going over it with a roller to make sure it's properly stuck down. And then I worked on covering the rest of the cabin in much the same fashion, making sure my coverage was as good as I could get it. And you really want to make sure you are covering as much as you can with this material, because it does have the extra benefit in most cases of lowering the radiant heat in your car, which basically means your interior is going to be much cooler in summer. For the gaps in the material, you can cover them with an acoustic tape, but I just used Gorilla Tape as I had quite a bit of it lying around, and you can just cut it to size and then cover the gaps like So before moving on to the last piece of the puzzle. On day 3, the last piece of the puzzle to fit was mass loaded vinyl, or MLV for short, and it is a much more rigid and unforgiving material when compared with the other two. As I mentioned earlier, I made the silly error of cutting my carpeting up, but even whole, you can use it as a stencil for each area, and you can see that I'm going around it with a marker and then cutting out with scissors, and it is really easy to cut, so you can make quick work of it. And then once you have your piece cut to size, I like to use a landmark when placing it, which in this case is the screw just here that holds the carpeting in place, and this allows you to position the rest of the MLV with ease. And then once most of it is done, you might need to do a bit of nipping and tucking here and there to make sure it all fits, and this is when you'll likely come across what makes this material such a pain to work with. You'll notice with MLV that depending on how it lays, it will bunch in certain areas, and I found that the easiest way to address this is to make some overlapping cuts that essentially get rid of the bunching and makes the material sit much nicer. I also took the time to make sure my covering was on point by covering as much of the footwell as possible to stop the tyre and road noise coming through, as this is a key area of note and I don't want to miss it. And again, this landmark came in handy and also allows the material to stay in place, which is very much what we want. You can then repeat this on the driver's side before moving on to the rear of the cabin. As with the closed cell foam, the rear of the cabin is much easier to do as the shapes and install of the material itself isn't as complicated as the front, but don't let the ease or easier installation fool you into thinking it's actually easy, as you can still make mistakes with cutting. That old saying of measure twice and cut once is an old saying that has endured for a reason. Luckily, I had extra material to rectify this rookie error, and I hope by seeing all these mistakes it brings home the sense that this is quite a forgiving process, just really tiring, especially if you have to do large sections again. And it should also drive home the virtue of patience, which is very much needed. Speaking quickly again of landmarks, these clips on the rear seats are great for hanging MLV from, so the install is super easy for the rear of the seats, and once complete, your car should be essentially covered in a sea of mass loaded vinyl. And you'll notice that this material is just laid on as is in most places, no sticking needed, although some people might use glue and tape to stick it all down. Once the last of the MLV is down, you can then go about reinstalling your carpeting, and it's essentially the reverse of removing it. And you might be wondering what on earth happened to my reinstall for my carpeting, as I essentially cut it all up. And the answer is I had to buy another one for £70 and use that, which is really an avoidable cost. And before we move on to the results, it's probably worth covering costs quickly just so you have an idea of how much it may cost you if you decide to do this. I picked up a car kit from Dodomat that cost $84.99, and that came with the first two layers we need, which is the sound deadening mats and the closed cell foam. The MLV was purchased separately at $27.99 a roll, and I bought 4, costing $111.96. I then picked up some prep spray that is essentially a degreaser that cost $7.99, along with a roller that I wanted to use to compare to my ridged ones that cost $6.99, coming in at a total cost of $211.93, but your cost may vary depending on the size of your vehicle, and you have to ask, was it all worth the cost and hard work? Looking at the results, I'm going to start by sharing how I actually recorded them, as all these results are recorded on my phone with an external mic that does not automatically adjust the gain. If you're not familiar with automatic gain, it's basically the default on most phones that adjusts mic sensitivity so that you get a consistent audio level. In practice, this means it will dull parts that are too loud and raise parts that are too quiet, which is obviously not something we want, as we want to be able to hear the actual difference in sound before and after in its purest form. So that's why it's best to use an external mic that does not auto adjust gain, which is what I did. Also, when I recorded these results, I always travel on the same roads to make the comparisons as fair as possible. I also try and do them on the same day where possible to try and mitigate the difference in circumstances, as one day might be windier than the next, so I try and control that as much as possible. At the very least, I'll never do tests when it's raining, as that just makes driving a whole lot louder and doesn't make sense to compare it to a dry day. Now, before doing a before and after with the decibel meter, just have a listen first to see how much of a difference you can hear in these next set of clips. Here is a before and after at 30, 50 and 70. hopefully you'll notice even with YouTube's compression, you can really hear the difference before and after at all speeds, or at least I can. But when you listen to the results again with the decibel meter visible, you might be somewhat shocked. I'm going to break it down by speed here, so we will start with comparisons at 30 miles an hour and then work upwards. You might be wondering if the before and after results are a typo, but they aren't, and it raises a few interesting questions straight away. Firstly, how do they get these averages? Well, in each 5-second-ish clip, I noted down each time the decibel meter changed as best I could, and then calculated an average logarithmically. And because the human ear essentially perceives sound intensity in a non-linear way, you can't just add a bunch of numbers together and then divide the total. You have to do it with a logarithmic formula. I did logarithmic averaging using a formula in Excel, but there are apps out there like Decibel X that will give you averages really easily without messing about with formulas. So that's the simple answer as to how I got these averages. Secondly, you might be wondering why these results sound so different even though the decibel results are essentially the same, and this is why I always try and tell people not to obsess over the decibel meter, as it's just part of the answer and not the whole. If we look at the sound files and convert them to a spectrogram in a sound program like Audacity, it will basically show a visual representation of the frequencies in a sound file, and when we compare them in a before and after, we can then see how they've changed. You'll notice in the top clip, you can see the red banding is higher up than it is in the bottom clip, and this essentially shows us that the lower frequencies between 0 to 2 kHz that are typically responsible for road and tyre noise have been slightly reduced. You'll also notice that there is less pink and more blue overall in the bottom clip when compared to the top, which shows us that the mid-range frequencies between 2 to 4 kHz, like wind noise, have also been reduced, and the higher frequency stuff between the 5 to 8 kHz band, generally responsible for sharp pitches, rattles, and higher pitched wind hiss, is much smoother with less grain, and what this means in practice is that the ride quality is just better. It's much more comfortable than it was before, but can the same be said at 50 miles an hour? You'll see the banding at the lower end between the 0 to 2 kHz responsible for tyre, road and engine noise isn't too different between the before and after sample, and this is quite typical as it is harder to block at these speeds, but you'll notice between 1.5 to 3 kHz that it's slightly less intense, so that wind noise and general airflow noise is lower, but the biggest drop you'll see at 50 is between the 4 to 8 kHz range, where you typically have that motorway hissing sound, that high-pitched rattles and squeaks that are really annoying, and these are pretty much gone. And you'll notice on the right hand side that these spikes in sound aren't as prevalent as they were before. But does that ring true at 70? At 70, the lower frequencies aren't too different, maybe slightly smoother, but when you look between 1.5 to 4 kHz, you'll notice the gradient is smoother, but it's beyond that between the 4 to 8 kHz band, where it's bluer and less grainy than before, meaning those higher frequency noises, like wind whistle, are much smoother and less grating, and it seems that it's the higher speeds where you see the most benefit, so it's especially useful if you're a frequent motorway traveller and do a lot of miles. And looking at the overall picture, although the decibel meter is higher in the after clip, we can see that generally when looking at the frequency changes we've made to the car as a result of adding the soundproofing, we've just created a car that is smoother, quieter, and more comfortable to drive, which I notice at all speeds, and it's probably worth talking about what these results mean in day-to-day driving life. One thing I've noticed on both shorter and especially longer journeys is that I'm arriving to my destination feeling much more refreshed and much less tired than I was previously, which might be to do with those mid to high frequencies becoming less obvious, as they are tiring on the ear, but it's genuinely great, and it was really unexpected, because normally when you focus on reducing sound, you just want the car to be quieter, but the obvious side benefit of that is that you're creating a much more relaxed driving experience, which has to be experienced to really appreciate. And I know know one of the comments I flush down the memory hole often is people saying, why do all this work when you can just buy a new car? Firstly, I don't think you can just buy a new car. It's not like we're buying vegetables. Also, it costs money, and probably more than the £200 I spent doing this on a car I already own that's super reliable, so I really get the best of both worlds. I don't have to drive a big luxury car that costs tons to maintain just to experience a little luxury when I can do it myself for a fraction of a cost and keep my reliable car. Another benefit is that your music, podcasts and calls just sound better. You also don't have to pump the volume up as loud because you now have a quieter cabin, so you're doing your ears a huge favour here. You can drive to work in a much more relaxed driving environment while listening to music, a podcast or taking calls on a lower volume, essentially allowing you to arrive at your destination feeling more refreshed. And yes, you could just go out and buy some AirPods, but good luck having a conversation in your nice relaxing cabin without taking them out. You also benefit from the thermal insulation properties of the closed cell foam too, so great if you're in a particular hot environment. And it sounds like it's all upside here, but what are the downsides of doing something like this to your car? The main question I always get on my videos is how much weight have you added to your car? And my assumption is people are asking this for one of two reasons. But before I get to those, let's look at how much weight I've actually added. The roll weight of the first layer, which is the sound deadening layer, is about 11.7 kilograms, and I used about 60% of that roll. So we're looking at a total of about 7 kilograms. For the closed cell foam, the total weight isn't shared, but I basically used 98% of that material. As you remember, I wasted a ton of it filling in the gap in the passenger footwell, so the remainder I have left weighs 116 grams, representing about 2%. And if we extrapolate that out and convert into kilograms, it would be about 5.8 kilograms in total. So I've added about 5.6 in weight using that material. The mass loaded vinyl is about 6 kilograms a roll, and I used 4. So that's a total of 24 kilograms, giving us a grand total of about 36.6 kilograms when we add it all up. This essentially means, in measurable real world terms, to give you a picture, if that weight was a human, I've added a healthy 10 to 11-year-old child to my car. If it were an animal, it would be a medium to large dog like a border collie, or if it were an inanimate object, it would be a medium-sized suitcase packed for international travel. But why does that matter? 2 words: fuel economy. This is the first reason I think people are asking how much weight has been added to the car. The worry is that you'll be wrecking your fuel economy. So let's see if I've wrecked mine, shall we? About 2 years ago, before I did any soundproofing to my car, I did an MPG test, and with a combination of local and motorway driving, I averaged a mile per gallon score of about 54.2 miles per gallon. When I tested this again on a longish trip, I managed to average 49.4, so it's about a drop of 5 miles per gallon, which isn't nothing, but I am still almost pushing 50. So for me, I aren't really concerned with that drop, but it is worth keeping in mind that your MPG will likely take a hit of about 8 to 10%, which frankly I can live with. Also, my engine is 2 years older than it was, so the soundproofing can't really take all of the responsibility for that dip. Over time, engines are just not going to be as efficient as they once were, so personally, I wouldn't worry about miles per gallon. The second comment I seem to see is people suggesting I need to fit bigger brakes because of the added weight, but to me, this observation makes no sense in my context. Typically, it's just me and my wife in the car most of the time, but with this extra added weight, it's like we've added a 10 to 11-year-old child as a constant passenger. And you have to ask yourself, in normal circumstances, would you add bigger brakes just because your child got in the car? To me, when it's phrased that way, it's a bit of a silly question. We aren't adding tons of weight to the car here, so I'm not worried about impacting my ability to stop. I can see people worrying if they typically have 4 people in the car plus the extra weight the soundproofing materials adds, but for my circumstances, it isn't a concern. But if you worry, you can just add less material. And speaking of material, if I were looking to improve my results, I'd have probably spent more money on better materials, and this is really the same observation I made when soundproofing my doors. So it's kind of funny that I'm repeating what I have in the past here, but the reason why you should probably opt for the best materials you can afford is simply because not only are you getting the best results you can possibly get, but really you're only going to be doing this once. So you might as well do the best you can and buy the best materials. And if you're wondering what it's like to soundproof the rest of your car, you don't have to, because that video is the next one for you.